our previous examples were primarily focused on eukaryotes with a mitochondria. And those organisms do aerobic respiration. This is using oxygen as that terminal electron acceptor in the mitochondria there to pull the electrons through. Now, there are other ways to get energy. You're probably aware that there is also anaerobic respiration, and you may have heard of this term called fermentation. So let's look at what those are here. So anaerobic respiration implies that it is still respiration, but the anaerobic part means there's no aerobic. Well, the aerobic part here is oxygen, so there's no oxygen here. This is going to mean that we're going to use a terminal electron acceptor other than oxygen. So something else is going to pull the electrons through the electron transport chain. Fermentation, on the other hand, is kind of an alternate pathway. We have organisms that go through glycolysis but can't do the respiration side of things. That means that this molecule pyruvate is going to build up. And remember, we talked about when products build up, reactions start going slower and slower. We also have NADH that was formed that also is going to build up. So the results of glycolysis are actually going to slow down glycolysis. Fermentation is a way to deal with those end products and to keep glycolysis going. So we'll talk about both of these things in a little bit of detail here. But obviously, certain organisms, mainly microbes, can do anaerobic respiration and fermentation. You can do a little bit of fermentation, but you cannot live off it. So microbiology is the realm where we talk about a lot of the exotic types of making energy. So let's look at our overall path first to reorient ourselves. So we have glycolysis. Pretty much everything on Earth does glycolysis. But what we do with the pyruvate after that is kind of where things break down. Some organisms can send it into respiration, and some of those use oxygen as the final electron acceptor. Others don't use oxygen. They use other substances and pull those electrons through the electron transport chain. But there's a whole group of organisms that don't do that at all. This is where fermentation comes in. It's a side kind of set of reactions to deal with pyruvate. So let's talk about why we might need fermentation. Well, as we said, glucose goes into glycolysis. It produces 2 net ATP, but it also makes those 2 pyruvate molecules and 2 NADH. Okay. So the ATP is great. We can use that to power other reactions. But what happens when NADH and pyruvate start to build up? So they're going to build up and up and up. And glycolysis, this series of reactions, is going to slow down because our end products are building up. So we really need to get rid of that NADH and that pyruvate to keep glycolysis going. Now you can probably see just keeping glycolysis going is not super efficient. You're only getting 2 ATP out of this. But for some small organisms, this is enough to live. There are different flavors of fermentation, let's call them. One that you might be familiar with, very important for bread making and the beer and wine industry, is ethyl alcohol fermentation. I would argue this is probably one of the most important human biotech reactions, right? And ultimately, like beer and wine fermentation was a common way of storing energy in food. Food goes bad. Ethyl alcohol helps prevent microbial growth. So through fermentation, you can store your food longer as beer or wine. Now, bread, on the other hand, turns something that we have in the seed of wheat or something like that into something that is more appealing and also can store longer in some cases. So we can produce these things, and the ethyl alcohol in here is a great preservative, but in your bread, there's no ethyl alcohol left over. It actually gets baked off. So there, one of the side kind of waste products, effectively, of this reaction is important. So let's look at the reaction, and then we'll see what's going on. So we take pyruvate, or pyruvic acid here, and some hydrogens, and we're going to produce CO2. Now that's the important part for bread, right? If you like fluffy bread that rises, CO2 is very, very important for that. And using fermentation is a great way to produce that CO2. There are other ways, but for most breads, we're using yeast, which does this fermentation. Now, beer and wine. Beer, usually people like carbonated beer, and that carbonation is coming from that CO2 in there. Again, a waste byproduct, but it makes it taste so much better. I guess taste in the mouth feel of it is better, right? So in these cases, we are also producing acetaldehyde, which then gets further broken down into ethanol, which is the alcohol part in there. And that NADH that was in there is getting converted back into NAD+. So we're restoring the things that need to go into glycolysis, that NAD. So we're getting rid of the byproducts and restoring that NAD so it can take more high energy electrons. So we're kind of restoring that pool of NAD+ to keep glycolysis going. In the process, producing what is ultimately a toxin, right? It is also an intoxicant, so people kind of like that, but it is technically toxic. It's not good for you. But this process is not enough for us to survive, right? We don't do ethyl alcohol fermentation. Something like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, baker's yeast, that can survive off ethyl alcohol fermentation. There are other microbes that can do this as well, but this is enough for the single-celled yeast to survive. Now, ultimately, this is not great for yeast. Ethyl alcohol, ethanol, is a toxin, and yeast, generally, your normal strains of yeast, can take up to about 5 to, at the most, with the craziest strains of yeast that have been bred by humans, about 21% alcohol. So in fermentation reactions where we're making beer and wine and things like that, the yeast produce so much alcohol through fermentation that they end up killing themselves in that process. It is a toxin, right? We are producing a toxic product there. Now, another one that you might have heard of, particularly if you're interested in exercise science and things like that, or some other types of food, is lactic acid fermentation. You can do this type of fermentation, but you cannot survive off it. Okay, you might have heard of lactic acid production. That occurs when you stress your muscles to exhaustion. Basically, you're working so hard that you cannot get enough oxygen to your tissues to do aerobic respiration. Lactic acid fermentation starts as like a last-ditch effort to make some energy. It's like, I don't have enough oxygen. You're telling me to keep moving. What am I going to do? Well, it does some fermentation. And as we've seen, it produces very little energy, but it's something. It's better than nothing. If you're interested in biotech, particularly food biotech, many microbes also do these lactic acid fermentation reactions. And we use that to help produce things like cheese and yogurt and soy sauce. The acids that are produced here actually help preserve these food things. So yogurt lasts longer than raw milk because of the acid that is in there. Same thing with cheeses and soy sauce as well. So what is the reaction here? Well, again, it's a way of getting rid of the pyruvate and the NADH. So we take pyruvic acid and convert it into lactic acid, and in the process, we restore that NAD+ here. That keeps glycolysis going, right? So glucose goes in, glycolysis happens, and we make NADH and pyruvate. We got to get rid of those to keep this cycle going. So we go through lactic acid fermentation. We can keep doing a bit of glycolysis, but that's not enough, right? That is nowhere near enough to keep a large multicellular organism going. So you can only do lactic acid fermentation for so long. And after that, you have to slow down, stop, and get enough oxygen to restore that aerobic respiration. The main cells that can do these lactic acid fermentation or do it frequently are red blood cells and skeletal muscle. Red blood cells because they don't have mitochondria. Skeletal muscle because that's where most of our energy is being spent to move us around. Okay, you're going to ask me at some point or be thinking about it, lactic acid, exercise, that's what causes muscle soreness, right? And stiffness. We used to believe that, and we used to think that stretching after a run or something like that helped reduce that lactic acid and then reduce soreness. But it actually, a lot of the research isn't pointing to that any longer. It doesn't seem that the lactic acid is actually causing that muscle soreness and stiffness. Instead, it's the micro tears in the muscle fibers themselves that are likely causing that reaction, that stiffness, soreness reaction. And then when you repair those, you get stronger. So that is what the current science is pointing towards there. There are many other types of fermentation, right? Here's a chart with different types. I'll point out some interesting ones. So here's our ethyl alcohol production. We're using pyruvate there, producing CO2. This one produces 2,3-butanediol. Okay, whatever that is. Here's one that's interesting. Formic acid is produced. Formic acid, ants make that. Formis is the group of ants, so formic acid produced in ants. Acetic acid, vinegar, that is produced. Sometimes, by accident, we get bacteria in our brewing and we produce vinegar instead of fine wine. Other things, isopropanol, butanol, those are important industrial solvents. Lactic acid production, like I said, cheese and butter, and other things E. coli can do, like succinic acid production here. So there are many different types of fermentations. But what is the one thing that is lacking in all of these? Well, that's ATP. No energy is actually produced by the fermentation. The only thing that it does is it keeps glycolysis going. So up here, right, we produce ATP and glycolysis, but all of these fermentation reactions produce no ATP. They are just keeping glycolysis going. So they don't directly produce any ATP. So like I said, microbes can survive off this, but you cannot. You need more ATP than that. There are whole groups of microbes called obligate anaerobes that grow without oxygen, so they can never do that aerobic respiration. In fact, oxygen is toxic to them. Now, not all obligate anaerobes do fermentation. Many of them do, but some of them do a different thing called anaerobic respiration. This is mainly prokaryotes, so bacteria and archaea, but anaerobic respiration is respiration without oxygen as the terminal electron acceptor. They use something else. Now, unfortunately, oxygen has a very strong pull on electrons. Other things are a little less powerful pulling on those electrons. That could be things like sulfur and sulfate and nitrate. Things like methanogens in ruminants' guts, like in cows and stuff like that. They can take carbon dioxide and form methane out of it. There are organisms at the bottom of the ocean and in the ocean. So here's a bloom of hydrogen sulfide producing anaerobes in here. You can see these bright green colors in the water here. They're going through the electron transport chain, but instead of oxygen at the end, they have these nitrogen containing compounds. Now, this means that they're going to produce a little bit less ATP in that last step than aerobic respiring organisms. So let's review here. I want you to tell me what is the correct order of ATP produced from most to least. So go ahead and think about this. Pause the video, look back, think about what we've just talked about. Okay, we're looking for most to least. All right, I told you what produces the least at the beginning of this lecture. That was fermentation. So we're looking for something with fermentation at the end, right? So we have two options here. Here, fermentation definitely does not produce the most. So A and B are out. So we're looking at C and D. All right, and then we have to consider, is it anaerobic respiration or aerobic respiration that produces the most? Well, I said oxygen pulls those electrons stronger than these other things. So aerobic respiration produces the most ATP. Anaerobic respiration comes in second. It produces more than fermentation, like way more, but less than aerobic respiration. So our answer here would be D. Aerobic respiration the most, then anaerobic respiration, then fermentation. Okay, aerobic respiration, that uses oxygen as the terminal electron acceptor. Anaerobic respiration, that's using other molecules as terminal electron acceptors. It's less effective at that. That's things sulfur, sulfate, nitrate, other things like that. It's just not quite as strong of a pull there. But it's still way better than fermentation. Fermentation doesn't produce any ATP. It instead relies on glycolysis to produce those 2 ATP, and then fermentation is dealing with the pyruvate and NADH that are produced from glycolysis. It gets rid of those products at the end to allow glycolysis to continue. We talked about 2 specific types of fermentation. Ethyl alcohol fermentation, that's a key biotechnology that humans have used to preserve food. Baking bread, the CO2 produced in that reaction makes your bread rise. The ethyl alcohol basically evaporates in the baking process. Beer and wine, on the other hand, the alcohol is actually a preservative in there. Lactic acid fermentation, that's also used to preserve food, cheese, yogurt, things like that. But human cells can also do this, particularly when they're not getting enough oxygen, like in super high-end exercise, when you're sprinting away from the saber-toothed tiger, right? That's when you just need that extra little bit and you go into your lactic acid fermentation. But you can't do that for long because you don't produce enough energy out of that to survive off of. All right, we said aerobic respiration is producing the most, then anaerobic respiration, and finally fermentation, the least ATP out of